Hi, everybody. I'm Crystal Haynes. Tonight on Greater Boston, residents of a public housing building in Boston were trapped for 2 weeks after their only elevator broke. So what went wrong, and what about other public housing buildings in the state? I'll talk to a local public housing resident, an advocate, and the head of the Boston Housing Authority. And later, the fight to raise the state's minimum wage to $20 an hour to catch up with the cost of living. Trapped in their own homes for more than 2 weeks. That was the reality for people living in a public housing complex in the South End while the building's only elevator was broken down. Now, that elevator was fixed after 15 days. And elderly and disabled residents were finally able to leave the building, but it was a rough 2 weeks without that elevator. And as residents told GBH News, it was far from the first time they've had this kind of problem.
I got to live here, but I don't want to be trapped. I do not want to be trapped.
Today is a nice full day. I can't even check my mail. It's in another building. You can't order anything because no one's going to bring it up to the 5th floor.
I got sciatica in my back. I got Crohn's disease. I depend on that elevator to get me downstairs and up.
I have a hand cycle. I ride it every day sometimes, and that's what really helps me live life. For my mental health, it's important to get out every day.
I've been here 3 years, and this elevator been breaking down now like twice a week, and then we're stuck.
Trappings happen a lot. The worst was when the children get trapped. They don't understand. They're in the elevator screaming. Some of them don't like to get on the elevator. They get on. If it makes a funny noise, they immediately get fearful because they don't know what's going on. I feel like this wouldn't be happening if I didn't live in a marginalized community.
Now, issues of access and repair extend far beyond just the Ruth Barkley apartments there in the South End. Now, public housing buildings across Greater Boston have faced similar problems. That's as Brookline Public Housing resident Arlene Hill knows all too well. She joins me now along with Philip Hillman, a member of the strategy team at the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization and the administrator of the Boston Housing Authority, Kenzie Bok. Welcome to the table here. I appreciate y'all being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, Kenzie, I have to ask you first. I mean, I imagine hearing the complaints, hearing those stories. I mean, the buck. A lot of folks, I will say, characterize this as the buck stops with you all.
Absolutely. And, you know, for me, I started as administrator at the Boston Housing Authority a couple of months ago. And obviously having this happen so early, it has just totally focused me on how we can do better. The BHA has a lot of great protocols in place. We put tenant coordinators at the bottom of a staircase to help people with groceries and mail in these situations. We did actually move several of those residents to hotels as the period lengthened. But the reality is, it's exactly as our residents said, you know, it's just not a way that we want people to be living, and we want to figure out ways that we can have these elevators be much more dependable. I mean, this was a real, like, specific crisis, and the frustration of not being able to get the part that we needed to replace this was just beyond. But obviously, we're looking at everything to try to figure out how do we get as many of these vulnerable elevators in a better state as we can. Of course, the limitation is the pennies on the dollar that we get given in capital funding to do this work.
Arlene, you know.
It's not just elevators. I broke my wrist last Christmas because my front 3 steps were crumbling and falling apart. But my director, too, at my housing, cares about us. I know he does. It's not their fault. It's not like they got money and they're sitting on it saying we're not going to spend it on you. The state hasn't historically given us what we needed. Phil knows. He's a money remember guy.
Oh,
I
okay.
just know it's a lot. But Phil can tell you it's a lot of money the state hasn't put into us over a long period of time.
All right, well, Phil, tell us.
Well, when we talk about things like ongoing maintenance, and this is the issues like elevators, and that's the tragedy, that this has been benign neglect for a long period of time. And so the need is really 184 million operating subsidy for statewide for public housing. And right now we're at 107, which has gone through the legislation, but the greater need is 184. Now on top of that, we have capital issues with the public housing, and we need 8.5 billion. I know that seems like a lot, but
Just in Massachusetts?
Just in Massachusetts, and this is truly just the need. We did a lot of work and a lot of study to put that number together. And when you go back and look at the years of maintenance that just wasn't done, and you got things like roofs, heating, large ticket items that are in need to bring buildings back up to code. So we've got a lot of work to do, but there's hope. We believe that the bond bill coming out may be in a position to help us to address some of these needs. So we're really looking forward to what the governor will be bringing forward as her bond bill.
And Kenzie, I know that Massachusetts has a larger, if not the largest amount of public housing in the country. So then how do you wrap your arms around numbers like in the billions like Philip is talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's huge. So Boston Housing Authority is the biggest housing authority in the region. And for us, across federal and state public housing, just at BHA, we've got about $1.5 billion in deferred capital. So, I mean, it's an enormous problem. You know, I think it's a combination of we're always going to just try to chip away at it day by day. Like our residents, like the ones that you saw there, they deserve better. So, you know, for instance, this elevator here, we're upgrading like over the course of this fall. And now because we saw how it failed, we're also upgrading the 3 that are its sisters that came in at the same time, because we're sort of like, okay, well, if this one failed, then there's probably a similar problem. Ironically, even though it's 20 years old, it's one of the newer elevators in our system. So, you know, it's like, okay, we can be proactive about saying, no, let's just not do the 1, let's do the 4. But across my portfolio, I've got 105 elevators. Like, so I think it's a combination of you need your public housing authorities doing everything they can and being smart about our money and really like trying to get ahead of problems like this. But at the same time, we just need more resources.
Yeah,
I think it's a problem of the state, the country. They don't look at people who are older, are disabled, come from trauma, have issues. We're the others. We're the great others that no one likes to think about, puts us in a box that we don't belong in.
You know, we were talking, Arlene, about I grew up in public housing in Springfield, and when you're in a situation where you have a need for the building, the only home you have, and can't get that met, it's very frustrating. You mentioned you broke your wrist recently. Talk to me about, you know, what you've experienced in the past in public housing.
I love where I live.
Yeah.
I have the whole world, every nationality, every type of person. I really love where I live. The people are great. But it's so demoralizing. My ceiling fell on my face 2 different times, the ceiling. They just don't have the money, and our voices are not heard. I don't want to say why, but this year I've met with the governor. I was very impressed, and she listened to me, and she cared. I feel like people are starting to care. People are beginning to say they deserve good housing, too, healthy housing, just healthy is good enough. I don't need lawns and things like that. I just need healthy houses.
Yeah. Philip, as we look at the numbers, you know, and the work that the organization is doing to secure that funding, what are the conversations like with lawmakers as you're trying to get this parts of the bond bill?
Excellent question. Because when we first started out, we started to recognize early on that this was below the radar screen, that we were doing as much education around this issue as we were getting them to get on board. So once we started to get, you know, a critical mass of people who actually understood what we were talking about in terms of deferred maintenance, capital needs. We found that we had a lot of partners in the legislature that worked with us to help us advance our agenda forward. But the greater piece was not really having this on that radar screen. And that was, in the beginning, disheartening. But I think GBIO has done an excellent job of getting this up to the forefront and getting people to see this. We recently had an event where we had 1,400 people. And we were talking specifically about the campaign. And we had the lieutenant governor was there, the mayor attended, and I think that also would serve us well in terms of people understanding we're here for the long run.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think what Phil's saying about visibility is so important. I mean, especially with housing costs going where they are in Boston,
yes.
like it's really our public housing communities that are the communities that are anchoring people in place in the city. I mean, low-income people, yes, but also just seniors and families with children. Like, you're getting to a place where if you don't have 2 six-figure earners, you can't afford an apartment.
That's right.
And so we're the ones in public housing that are really like anchoring folks and making sure kids can still grow up in the city, folks can still grow old in the city. But I think sometimes there's been this orientation where it's like public housing's just there, and people just like, it's out of sight, out of mind. And so I think really bringing, our residents forward and talking about their needs, and also talking about what assets they are to the community and like how much it means to anchor them here in place. I think it's a really important shift.
How do you manage in terms of the responsibility when you have a situation like this that obviously is high visibility, but there are different aspects and layers to the management of these properties, whether it be federal, whether it be state, and whether it be just specifically BHA? Like, how do you manage all the players in a situation like this, especially when, you have to access the money, you have to access some sort of workflow to keep the maintenance up on these buildings?
Yeah, so I think it always has to be a balance of being responsive to the immediate situation, like I mentioned, right? So that's tent coordinators, getting people to hotels, communication. We can always do better on those things, and there's definitely a piece of the work that's sort of doing an after action and saying, what could we do better here? Then it's, how do I specifically address this elevator? Like I said, how do I address the ones that are in the same generation? But then we also have to play the long game of how are we going to get the kind of money where we're not always behind? Because to exactly your point, we could focus on this elevator today, and then another one across the system goes out tomorrow. And so, what I'm always trying to do right now, especially as I get into this role, is to try to solve the specific problem, but then try to figure out what's the lesson for our overall system about being more responsive. And I think for the BHA, we're always going to try to do everything we can with the resources we can, but then we need advocates who are pushing for us to just have more resources and give our people what they deserve.
How would you describe the general condition of the housing in the authority?
I think, folks in my staff work incredibly hard to keep up our apartments. I mean, just like Arlene was saying, then frankly, people who work in public housing, like, they're there for the heart of it. You can make more money doing something else. These days you can work remote. Like, if you're working in person, doing this work, it's because you care about people.
I'll testify to that. They're great people.
But I think what we see is, it's one thing to take care of the smaller things. Like, no amount of staff work's going to solve a roof that has holes in it. And the problem is that then you start to get, if you get water inside the envelope, that's where you start to get mold. That's where you start to get these other issues. So I think staff work really hard, but it's the big picture issues. We're hoping actually that the focus on green retrofits and therefore on building envelopes can help us finally really tackle some of these big systems issues in public housing.
So if you had to give a grade between A being good and F being failing, what would you say?
Well, with the resources we have, I think our people are doing absolutely everything that they can. I think that $1.5 billion behind where we're supposed to be in terms of capital resources, that's obviously not an A when it comes to like federal support and state support for what we need to be doing.
I'll say the people are an A. The historically ignorance of us is a D.
Yeah, okay, I appreciate that.
We're changing that, and that's, GBI has really helped me. And having that place, having a door I could lock when I came from trauma meant the world for me and allowed me to get healthy and grow. We will always need state housing. All the immigrants coming in, they'll need places to stay. You know, we need public housing. Only 4 states in the whole country have public housing. We're very lucky. I always say this is the best state.
Yeah.
Because it is.
And as we look, Philip, about as the folks on the State House and looking into funding that, what would be your message to them?
I think it's time to get creative.
Yeah.
I think it's time to recognize we're in a crisis mode. We cannot afford to lose any units. We have immigration issues that we're trying to resolve in terms of finding people housing. And finally, we want safe, dignified, quality housing for everyone in this state.
Everyone deserves a home.
Perfect. Well, thank you all for coming. This is obviously a conversation we could have for a long time, and we'll continue to do so. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. The state's minimum wage hit $15 at the beginning of this year, the last of a series of gradual hikes signed into law back in 2018. But a lot has happened since then, and now a group of lawmakers are pushing to raise it again. Their bill would increase the minimum wage to $20 an hour by 2027. It would also raise the minimum wage for tipped workers to $12 an hour. That is up from just $6.75 right now. One of the bill's sponsors joins me to discuss this, State Senator Jason Lewis, Vice Chair of the Committee on Labor and Workforce Development. Also with us this evening is Rob Stevens, a minimum wage worker and fair wage organizer. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you.
Great to be with you, Crystal.
I want to start with you, Rob. We're hearing these numbers for the minimum wage as it sits. Has this been, in your experience, a livable wage?
No. Well, first, let's start off with even $20 is not sufficient. That's even a bare minimum, because when you look at that over the course of a month, we're talking $3,200. That's without taxes. You'd be hard-pressed to find a place where they say 1/3 of your income should be towards rent for $1,000 in the Commonwealth. So we got to start with that. That's a bare minimum. But what I'm making right now at Starbucks is $16.25. There are Starbucks within the Commonwealth that unionize that are only making minimum wage. I call it weaponized kindness, where if you don't know it's a kind gesture, or if it's a kind gesture if you don't know that it was a weapon to punish other people. So there are baristas making that minimum wage. But then we got to take out taxes. And for those like myself who have to have health insurance for a family, that $16.25 dwindles down to about $5 an hour.
Wow.
So even could work 40 hours a week, which they do not schedule anyone for that amount. That's $200 a week. It is not livable. At this point, the health insurance that they take out is so much that I can't afford co-pays, so I just go without seeing a doctor. And these are the sacrifices we're making while I know my productivity's worth. When you take the profits of the day, you divide it by the hours we're open, we're making $500 to $700 an hour. And that is being siphoned out of our communities. It is not being reinvested in workers. It is definitely not being spread among the community. We don't have I don't have purchasing power. And when you hear things like Starbucks plans to do $20 billion in stock buybacks over the next 3 years, you wonder why they're not investing in the people who are the front lines, who have been the front lines, and especially over the past few years.
Senator Lewis, I'm going to ask you the question that I'm sure you've heard from a lot of other folks, which is that age-old argument that if we raise the minimum wage, then small businesses will suffer. You are backing this bill to raise the minimum wage. Tell me what you say to folks who bring that argument to you.
Sure. Well, the first thing I say is that nobody who's working, a full-time job like Rob and so many hundreds of thousands of others in Massachusetts trying to support themselves and their families, should be living in poverty. They should be able to earn, a fair wage with decent benefits and be treated with respect and dignity on the job. And that's what we're trying to do with have, a minimum wage that gets at least closer to reflecting a living wage. And in terms of what I would say to folks, who might oppose an increase in the minimum wage and have certainly always opposed it in the past, It's interesting. From 2014, when the minimum wage was $8 an hour in Massachusetts, to where we are today, as you said, we reached $15 an hour at the beginning of this year. In that same time frame, the Massachusetts state economy added more than 250,000 jobs. And today we have the lowest unemployment rate that we've, I think, had ever. So we've certainly seen tremendous growth in our state economy. That's notwithstanding the years of the pandemic. And so it's certainly not the case that we can't increase the minimum wage and also continue to see our economy grow and thrive.
Well, Rob, I mean, here's the other thing. I'm sure you've heard this before. Folks might say, then get a better job. That these jobs are for people who are, high school students or college students. I mean, what do you say to folks like that?
Well, first of all, since I'm on the front lines, let me tell you that there's one high schooler that works with us. We're talking about post-college. A lot of people in transitions, like myself. I had a career. 20 years I worked in radio, and I found myself unemployed. So this is supposed to be like a rebuilding moment for me, but what it became was a trap. And to those who say, well, the free market, just get another job. When I started at Starbucks, I had multiple job offers. They were all ranging within the $16 to $19 an hour. And what I tried to do is what the free market says. I negotiated with everyone. And I said, hey, could I get a little more money here? But what it boiled down to for me was health insurance. Some companies want you to wait a year, some 3 months. And I said, well, I can't go without it. It's that little thing that humans need. So when I tried to negotiate, they said, you don't have coffee experience. It is what it is. And the funny thing is when we just got a new CEO a few months ago, they gave him an $8 million sign-on bonus just for taking the job. $8 million, hadn't done a day of work, didn't have coffee experience. He came from Pepsi. Maybe caffeine experience was his slip in.
Okay.
But this money is going around, and it doesn't matter when you're at this level, when you're trying to rebuild or you find yourself unemployed or whatever it is, it becomes a trap for you. There is no way out. I cannot afford a car. I've had to turn down better job offers because I don't have a vehicle. Our infrastructure isn't really set up for people to not have a car. So it's very difficult. And I think that's also why we have people forming unions in bigger numbers than ever before, because now we're starting to realize that if it's just me, and I've done this many times, and you're just trying to negotiate, the company goes, nah, it is what it is, or leave it. And then you're really trapped amongst many jobs that are all paying roughly minimum wage. When you have the union, that leverage all of a sudden turns the tides, and you can start to negotiate for higher wages.
Well, that's my other question, Senator Lewis. As we talk about the bill, what are some of the provisions in there for folks who are union workers, for small family businesses? I know that always comes up. Like if you own a pizza restaurant with your family, how does that work? Like things like that.
Sure. Absolutely. We do have to be, sensitive to the ability of our small businesses and our nonprofits, to absorb this wage increase. Rob's talking about a huge global corporation like Starbucks. Those companies, I have no doubt that they can afford to pay a higher minimum wage to their frontline workers. They absolutely should be doing that. But in terms of, thinking about smaller businesses, we recognize the challenge, and that's why we would propose in this bill to phase in the increase to $20 an hour. So it wouldn't happen, overnight. We're proposing that it would be phased in over a 4-year period. So the minimum wage would go up from $15 to $16.25, and then continue up from there until it reaches $20. The other thing to recognize is that as the minimum wage goes up, there's very strong economic research that shows that almost every one of those dollars that workers are receiving, they are then turning around and spending that money in their local community for, groceries and rent, health care and other costs. And so that money is helping to boost the local economy, including small businesses in the communities that they live in.
Rob, what difference in your life would it make if you were making $20, $25 an hour?
It would make, see, this is the weird part. For some of the people at my company, it's couch change. It's nothing. For me, it is life changing. This is where we talk about you being able to afford the American dream or chase after something or not be stuck in this caste system. And this is how I could get out. I just want to point out too, speaking to local businesses, because I've been since 2017, I've been searching for jobs. And I got to say, the local shops pay more than the huge chains. I've watched many people leave Starbucks because they're making in the 20s, and these are small mom and pops, and they're just out competing when it comes to wages all over the place. And that's just from real life experience. I don't know what statistically speaking, but just even the offers that I've gotten were from local companies, and they were extraordinarily more. But again, it's a trap. I didn't have a vehicle, so I have to turn these things down. And I'd like to point out that, you know, when FDR implemented the minimum wage in 1938, he said this was not meant to be a bare subsistence living. This was meant to be the wages of a decent living. That's what we're asking for here, decency. Because right now, it's a travesty how many people that I talk to every day or I witness working grueling hours at jobs that are just very unthankful, just cannot make ends meet. And since FDR had implemented this in 1938, up until 2014, almost 85 years, it had only gone up $8. That's $1 a decade. We need to keep that in perspective, because when you hear people fighting against this, you have to question what motivates that. Is there profits in that? Because we're just asking, like the senator said, to have some kind of purchasing power, to be able to pay rent without going into debt or having every end of the month be extremely stressful, or choosing between gas and groceries.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to have to leave this conversation there, but I know it's going to be one that's going to be continuing as we look to see where this bill goes. Thank you both for being with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for tonight, but come back tomorrow. I'll talk to the head of a local nonprofit working to find stable housing for kids facing homelessness here in Massachusetts. Plus, how the Boston Public Library is fighting against censorship with its new Books Unbanned card. That and more tomorrow at 7. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.